Inside America's Boardrooms, the informational show for board members and corporate secretaries. Brought to you with knowledge partners NASDAQ, the Center for Audit Quality, and PwC. Along with content contributors Equilar, Meridian Compensation Partners, Wilson Sonsini Goodrich and Rosati, R.R. Donnelly, and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.
Welcome to this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter, the CEO of Boardroom Resources, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the show. We're going to be looking at an interesting topic today, Audit Committee Chair succession. And it's going to be our experts giving guidance to getting it right. And joining me, and let me start to our furthest right there. First of all, let's welcome Doug Maine, who's the Audit Committee Chair for both Broadsoft and Orbital ATK, Inc. Welcome, Doug.
Thank you.
And a familiar face on the show here, Cindy Fornelli, who's the Executive Director for the Center for Audit Quality. Welcome, Cindy.
Thank you, TK.
So, before we get started on sort of picking apart the succession, let's first identify the duties of the Audit Committee Chair, because I think that's important, and also then let's touch on the skill sets. And Doug, since you're in the trenches right now, why don't we start with you, and let's start with the duties.
Well, I would say there are about a half dozen duties that I would call out, including setting the agenda for audit committee meetings, actually leading the meeting itself. Of course, there's the role of overseeing the auditor. There's also the role of overseeing internal audit. There's also, and hopefully not too frequently, you're the point person if there are whistleblower calls. Also, if there's any sort of gray areas relative to accounting, that would fall under the Audit Committee Chairman. And of course, lastly, then there's the whole area of enterprise risk management that will find its way to the Audit Committee, so cybersecurity, regulatory compliance, that sort of thing would be a duty as well.
Sydney, this is your space. Anything to add from a duties perspective, and then maybe you could touch on some skill sets.
Certainly. Well, one thing I would say to the list that Doug gave, which I think is spot on, is the increasing list of duties that audit committees seem to find themselves. And I have likened the role of audit committees in the past to, and I mean this with affection and with respect, to the kitchen junk drawer. Because in my house, at least, all of my important things are in that drawer, although they appear to be a mishmash. So, my keys, my passport. And I fear sometimes that that's what the audit committee has become. If the board's not quite sure where to put something important and critical, oftentimes it finds its way to the audit committee. And that's actually something that Mary Jo White, the chair of the SEC, has recently been focused on. Does the audit committee have so many things that it's been given that they don't have the space of thought, the space of time to focus on those core critical issues that Doug just outlined?
I believe they called it Audit Creep, Audit Committee Creep. And I can see where that would be a problem, but that's also a compliment in a way, because every time there's something that's a challenge to the board, I think that board members feel most comfortable that the audit committee has a process to be able to deal with those issues. Wouldn't you say that that's probably true?
Yes.
And that discipline, right? So you mentioned a little bit what are the skill sets that a good audit committee member or an audit committee chair needs. And as Doug mentioned, there's the oversight of the financial reporting process, so you have to understand, obviously, financial information, but also internal controls. You mentioned the whistleblower hotline, so that means you have to have some familiarity with the compliance systems. And I think bringing to the table, independence, objectivity, and skepticism, so that you can ask those tough questions of the financial reporting supply chain within the company.
Yeah, and we don't have time to talk about this, but cyber, which we've covered many times on the show, seems to be ending up, for the most part, in the audit committees as well.
And I don't know how you feel, Doug, but I worry about that. To me, cyber should be a full board sport. and
Yes.
not necessarily relegated to the
Completely
Audit
agree.
Committee.
And one of my boards, actually, for all the reasons you just cited, the Nominating and Governance Committee took on cyber as one of their responsibilities.
And that's because they didn't have enough on their agenda?
I wouldn't accuse them of that, but between the three of us, yes, that's the reason.
And that's not unusual,
Right.
okay, because people are trying to sort of spread the workload. I'm not sure it's necessarily, again, you have to make sure that people have skill sets in that committee to be able to do that, but I understand the process of that. So let's get to our topic, and that is Audit Committee Chair succession. And the reason we're talking about this is there's a change in with shareholder engagement, you're seeing chairs have responsibilities of talking to investors more, so that changes the skill sets that you have. We have this issue of the financial expert. I think most companies want that financial expert to be the chair, but not necessarily that. So you have that issue to deal with. And we have people are talking about rotation. There's all these issues that sort of center around that. And we want to make sure that audit committees are thinking about that right from the start of recruiting a board member to mentoring them to be able to do that. So, Doug, you have served in numerous audit committees and obviously are chair currently of two. Talk a little bit about if there's any thought on your boards on the front end of that relative to when you're recruiting people in, and then how you might mentor a successor.
Sure. I would start on the front end, assuming that you do not have a successor with the company, so you're going out and doing a search. In that case, certainly the current audit committee chairman should be involved in writing the specification for the board member and should be involved in the interview process. Then once the person comes on board, I think it's important that that person really be schooled in understanding the company and how the company makes money. Secondly, it's important that they understand risks, the risk profile, particularly as relates to financial statements, but also to the company's business and its reputation. And then lastly, it's important to Cindy's last point that the successor have sufficient knowledge to be able to ask the kinds of penetrating questions that are necessary, and moreover, be able to discern whether or not they've received an adequate answer.
And Doug, on your companies, do you see more discussion occurring when you're bringing people in? Because matrix is, a matrix is being pushed now to make sure that you have that, and this succession concept is something that nobody really thought about before. Are you seeing sort of that trend influence the types of discussions in the boardroom?
Absolutely, absolutely.
So Cindy, what's your experience relative to succession?
The one thing I would want to pick up on, Doug, that you mentioned that I think is really critical and doesn't get a lot of talk, and I think maybe is a newer process, and that is the importance of onboarding. Giving the new audit committee chair enough time and information so that he or she can do those things that Doug was talking about, really understand the company's business, really understand the risks and the strategies of the company. And so I think a really robust onboarding process and mentoring process, and given enough time to let the new audit committee chair really get up to speed, is a best practice. And I think that's relatively new. I'm curious in your experience if that's relatively new.
It is, and the other thing I would call out is that there's so many good sources of peer reviews as well as training that are available. As a successor, we should encourage the successors to attend those just as much as the audit committee chairman attends.
So let me give you a good example. So as the audit chair, you're going to meet with the external auditors maybe, or you're going to meet with the internal auditors, sometimes with the committee, sometimes just as chair.
Yes.
That to me would be a perfect opportunity to grab that potential successor and say, come with me to this meeting so that you can get comfortable with the types of conversations that go on. Wouldn't that be a good example?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm also on the audit committee, but not chairman of a third. And I would tell you that the time as chairman is 3 to 4 times the amount as versus just being a member of the audit committee.
That's the other thing people better be prepared for.
That's right, absolutely.
So as our time's running out, I want to ask you a question about rotation because that's important too. What are your philosophies, both of you, relative to what guidelines should be there for audit chair rotation? And Doug, I'll start with you.
First off, I think it's a good thing to do, to rotate. We all get stale after a certain point in time. And I would suggest a time frame of 5, maybe as long as 7 years would be a reasonable amount of time.
Cindy?
Well, I think we're seeing rotation both in the chair roles as well as on the board becoming more common in the boardroom. And I guess I would just say that one of my issues is that can't be in place of a robust self-evaluation. And so I think not only does the board need to do a self-evaluation, but I think each committee should do an evaluation, not only of how the committee is functioning, but also how each of the individual members on that committee is performing. And that might help ease into some of the succession planning and also some of this rotational issues, because I worry that sometimes we put in these other arbitrary mechanisms because we don't want to do the hard self-evaluation work.
Yeah, I worry when people say rotation, you come across boards that rotate people after a year or after 2 years. Typically, especially in the audit committee or now in the comp committee, a chair is just getting into a rhythm,
That's right.
at that point. And I think that's one pitfall. So I don't think it should ever be less than, say, 3 or 4. But that's something. And the other thing is, try not, when you describe it in your charter and stuff, try not to make it a specific year. Give yourself the flexibility of saying that 5 to 8 or as conditions warrant.
Yeah.
Because if not, if you make it stark and straightforward, sometimes you'll have investors that are sort of calling you on that. So that's the other suggestion that I might make.
Good advice.
Yeah. So listen, thank you both for joining us, and that will conclude this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again next week when we take a look at another critical topic that'll help you be a better board member or committee member. We'll see you then.
Join us again next week for Inside America's Boardrooms. Brought to you with Knowledge Partners, NASDAQ, the Center for Audit Quality, and PwC. Along with content contributors Equilar, Meridian Compensation Partners, Wilson Sonsini Goodrich and Rosati, R.R. Donnelly, and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.